At History Grunt, we look at history from the viewpoint of the vanquished, the losers, the conquered, and the victims, not from the side of the winners who get to dictate the story and take home the spoils. We spare a thought for the defeated whose stories are forgotten. History remembers the victors. We remember the cost. Today we look at the massacre of the Cathar people, perpetrated in the name of a merciful Christ by the Catholic Church on fellow Christians. A forgotten war that shaped Europe and shamed the Church of Rome.
This is not just a story about heresy. It is a story about the extermination of a culture and mass murder sanctioned by the Catholic Church. In the early 1200s, the Church authorized a crusade against its own people. Cities were massacred, communities erased, men, women and children killed without distinction, not because they posed any threat, but because they believed differently. What started out as a thorn in the side of the Pope ended up as a Holocaust and a massacre of the innocent, and the men who ordered it called it salvation. This was the genocide of the Cathars, when faith became a death sentence. History rarely presents itself as cruelty. In the early 13th century, southern France was home to a Christian movement that posed no military threat to anyone. The faithful raised no armies and preached no violence. They called themselves simply the good men and the good women. History remembers them as the Cathars. They believed the world was corrupt, that true faith required humility, and that the powerful and deeply political church had lost its way. They rejected oaths and warfare, and rejected any notion that salvation could be bought with money or indulgence. True salvation was personal and not granted by the church, and certainly was not something you could put a price on. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, in its base in Rome, could not tolerate such free thinking. The Cathars had to be brought under control by any means, even if it meant their very extermination. What followed was one of the most devastating religious persecutions in European history, the Albigensian Crusade. It claimed to be a war of belief against heresy, but it was a campaign of destruction, authorized by the church and executed by royalty and nobles. To understand what happened, we need to understand why the Cathars mattered. Southern France in the 12th century was culturally distinct from the north. It spoke a different language. Its towns were wealthier, more tolerant, and more independent. Religious pluralism was not an ideology other than the basic doctrine of be good and do no evil, but it was simply how life worked in the towns and villages where Jews, Catholics, and Cathars lived side by side. The Cathars believed that the material world was flawed, even evil, and that true goodness lay in spiritual purity. They lived simply. Their leaders owned nothing and rejected the accumulation of wealth. They travelled on foot. They healed the sick. They refused to swear oaths or take up arms. The very notion of a crusade against the Muslims ran contrary to their tolerant belief system. To many ordinary people, they seemed closer to the Christianity of the Gospels than the Church itself, and that was a problem for the Pope and his cardinals. The medieval Church was not just a spiritual authority, it was a political one, a descendant of the Roman Empire. Its power rested on hierarchy, obedience, and land. The Cathars rejected all three, and so undermined the Church not by open rebellion, but by example. Heresy, in this context, was not just theological error. It was a very real existential threat to authority of the Papal Empire, aka the Catholic Church of Rome. This was always going to end badly. At first, the Church tried persuasion. Preachers were sent south. Debates were organized between clerics and local Cathar leaders, but there was minimal success in converting the Cathars to accept the supremacy of the Catholic Church in matters of salvation. Cathar influence continued to grow, even among the nobility. Some lords protected them, while others simply tolerated them. Rome saw this as open defiance not just by the Cathars, but also the authorities who shielded them and even shared their views. In 1208, a papal legate was murdered under unclear circumstances. Responsibility was never firmly established, and conspiracy spread that the Pope had given orders to assassinate his own legate in order to create a justification for escalation. The Pope decided on a final solution to the Cathar problem and called for a crusade, not this time against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against fellow European Christians in France. Those who took part were promised forgiveness of sins, land and wealth. Northern Knights, many of them poor in land and revenue, many deeply devout believers in the Church as the arbiter of God's work on earth, answered the call. The crusade became a campaign of conquest wrapped in holy language. The target was not a single group, it was an entire region and its people, and the goal was the elimination of the Cathar culture. The first major city to fall was Béziers in 1209. Béziers was not a Cathar stronghold. In fact, most of its inhabitants were Catholics, but the city council refused to hand over those accused of heresy. That act of protection sealed its fate. When the Crusaders breached the city walls, a question was reportedly asked: how would they tell Cathars from faithful Catholics? The answer, attributed to a papal representative, has echoed through history: kill them all, God will know his own. Whether those exact words were spoken matters less than what followed. The city was massacred. Men, women, children were cut down without distinction. Churches became slaughterhouses. People who had fled to sacred spaces were killed where they prayed. By the end of the day, Béziers was burning. The entire city erased, not because it resisted militarily, but because it refused to betray its Cathar neighbors. The message was clear: dissent was not going to be tolerated. After Béziers, resistance collapsed quickly. Towns surrendered without fighting. Others were destroyed anyway, just to be sure. The crusade moved slowly and deliberately, exterminating all vestiges of the Cathar movement. Castles were besieged, populations were displaced, their land confiscated and redistributed to northern lords loyal to the Church as payment for services rendered. Extreme and murderous violence was used not only to defeat enemies, but also to terrify survivors. Little mercy was shown, and only on unconditional renunciation of Cathar beliefs. Conversion under torture was encouraged. Those who recanted might be allowed to live, but without their property. The goal was not coexistence, it was total and absolute eradication of a movement and its people. The most enduring symbol of Cathar resistance is the fortress of Montségur. Perched high in the Pyrenees, Montségur became a refuge for Cathars fleeing persecution. It was not a military base in any modern sense. It was a sanctuary, shelter from the genocidal storm. In 1243, after years of pursuit, royal and ecclesiastical forces laid siege to the fortress. It lasted months. As supplies dwindled, starvation set in, but escape was impossible. When Montségur finally fell, the defenders were given a choice: renounce their faith or die. More than 200 refused. They were burned alive at the foot of the mountain, not as criminals, not as enemy combatants, but simply destroyed to make a point. And that was: you have been defeated. Come to your senses and give up your beliefs. With the fall of Montségur, organized Catharism effectively ended. But violence alone was not enough. What followed was something more systematic: the Inquisition. This was not the dramatic spectacle of mass slaughter, just bureaucracy based on paperwork, testimony, and fear. People were interrogated about neighbors, family members, even the dead. Confession became a survival tactic, and accusation became the currency of self-preservation. Punishments varied. Some were imprisoned. Some were forced to wear marks of shame, while others were burned in the most horrible of deaths. Fire was the tool that purified. The Inquisition into the Cathar heresy was relentless. Cathars were not merely murdered, they were written out of existence. Deaths vary from 200,000 to 500,000. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of the Cathar population was killed, imprisoned or erased during the heresy campaign, and in the movement's heartlands, survival was limited. Entire populations, men, women and children, were murdered in a frenzy of slaughter fueled by religious fervor and greed. The Albigensian Crusade did more than eliminate a religious movement and the Cathar culture. It destroyed the autonomy of southern France. Local rulers were replaced and culture was reshaped, language declined, and power shifted north along with access to wealth. This was colonization carried out in the name of faith. For centuries, the story was told as a victory of orthodoxy over a weird cult. The Cathars were dismissed as misguided at best, dangerous at worst. Their destruction was framed as a necessary intervention of divine will into human affairs. In reality, it was the imposition of political dominance and a land grab masquerading as a religious crusade. Only later did historians begin to see the scale of what had been lost. Not just lives, but tolerance, pluralism, the possibility that Christianity might have taken a different path, one that rejected violence as a way to resolve problems, that embraced the sanctity of life above all. The Cathars left few written records, but their enemies left many. The Cathars were pacifists. We don't know their names, but they had their hopes and dreams like you and me. And yet, because they dared to believe in a better world, they were burned at the stake in an agonizing death. We know them largely through the words of those who destroyed them. That alone should give pause. When an institution kills its critics and then writes the account, truth becomes fragile. Their story is barely taught at school today. History has forgotten the victims of the Cathar Holocaust, whose words are lost in silence. But we at History Grunt remember them.
Remember the victims. Make our day and subscribe to hear more.